Hey guys, in today's video we've just finished having a look at the Marvel Legends Man-Thing wave, so of course the next video and the video that we're looking at today, we're going to be looking at the Build-A-Figure Man-Thing. So here's your 411 on Man-Thing. Man-Thing first debuted in Savage Tales Volume 1, Number 1, back in 1971. Standing him straight up, Man-Thing stands a little over 8 inches tall, about 8.5 inches to be exact. I was very, very excited to get my hands on Man-Thing. Man-Thing's actually been one of my kind of growing up characters that I've really kind of gravitated towards. Between him and Swamp Thing, and you know, there's always that debate back and forth between who's the cooler character, Swamp Thing or Man-Thing. But I've always really liked monster characters. I've always really liked monsters in general, but like when you get a character in comic books that is kind of more monster than he is man, it's always been like one of my own personal favorite characters. Man-Thing has been. He has a really distinct look on his face, which I think the sculpting on his face is really what makes him so unique versus Swamp Thing. And that's kind of like the one thing that, like, for me, the joke growing up was I could always tell, obviously, which Man-Thing is versus Swamp Thing because of the distinct difference of his face. Well, for his face, it's interesting, his design. And it's always been, again, one of my favorite characters growing up. I just love monsters. Abomination, Man-Thing, of course the Hulk, Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing and Man-Thing very, very similar, though. Got some great details, though, here on the figure itself. Primarily all kind of one color. It's this swamp green. It doesn't really get that far off track other than those colors. You get a little bit of lighter color here around the mossy areas of the arms and around the areas of the legs, but it stays pretty consistent with this one primary color of green. It's a very, very swamp-colored green. You get a little bit of dry brushing there of almost a gray that's added to it as well, but it really has some fantastic sculpting. I would almost have hoped, and I can't compare, obviously, one medium to the other or one company to the other, but I mean, this right here is what they could have done with Swamp Thing. I know we're not comparing Swamp Thing to Man-Thing, but this is what DC Universe could have done with a Swamp Thing multiverse figure. And I think this would have been a very, very successful outing. What we ended up getting, though, unfortunately, is the DC Universe Swamp Thing, which, as good as the figure is, it's basically all encapsulated in rubber. And I think, personally speaking, I prefer something where, sure, the joints are a little bit more visible, but you have a much more fluid, more posable figure as an end result. It's got some great sculpting, though, in the legs, again, the moss areas, the feet. I think one of the reasons why I really always liked this figure as well, the character at least, was because he, again, reminded me of like a Scooby-Doo monster. This would be something that you would see the gang running into in some bayou swamp somewhere. I did mention at the beginning of when we started this review, or the series of reviews for Man-Thing, that like his torso is a rubber. Like it's this rubber layered skin that's added over top of the plastic torso. It only really is in here. Here is plastic. The skirt has a little bit of that, but everything else basically is plastic, except for like the little moss areas that drape down over his feet. It's interesting that they would go this route. I'm almost surprised that if they were going to start here and give you like a rubber torso, why they simply just didn't carry it everywhere else. Because everywhere else is just dense plastic. It makes for an extra different texture, so picking up the figure, it feels very different here than it does for the rest of the body. But again, just some fantastic looking sculpting. The arms, the hands, you can see like all the little mossy areas. A little bit of brown has broken that up with the brown areas of the fingernails. But it's a very... If I was to get into figure photography, which obviously I'm not going to do that. I barely have enough time to review, let alone figure photography. But this would be a figure that if you had the right lighting and you had the right camera and different sceneries, I think this figure would really look good on camera. Like a really photogenic figure. Like if you had a photogenic figure, I would say this would be hashtag photogenic figure. Of course, he is a lot bigger than the other figures as well. So for example, I'm going to bring in Frank Castle, the Punisher. He is a little bit taller, not considerably tall, not to the extreme outrageous size difference that Swamp Thing was to regular DC Universe figures. He is of appropriate size. You know, he could have been a little bit taller, but at least he's not the monstrous size difference of that figure was to other figures. So he's of the appropriate, at least he feels like a substantial figure. I feel rewarded for having collected these figures and put this guy together. He's not like a Rocket Raccoon. He's definitely not like a Jubilee, where after I've put everything together, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, wow, this was my payoff. This is what I got as a result of it. I'm very happy with this figure. This is probably one of my favorite collect and connect figures in recent memory, or Build-A-Figures in recent memory. It's just got a lot of cool things going to it. Doesn't really have a lot of colors, granted, but he does really look very, very awesome indeed. Poseability on this guy, by the way. His head is on a ball joint, despite the fact that his head sits further down. It's not really at the top like most figures are. It's a little sunken, a little further down there. Shoulders are on universal joints, so they hinge outward, and you can rotate the arms all the way around. He's got the swivel in the bicep, hinge on the elbow, and rotation and hinge on the hands. Despite its size, you still get the upper torso crunch. And I gotta say, it's just really rewarding to pose this guy, for the fact that this part here feels like it's a different material. You get your waist swivel, so that's still there. You get also your thigh swivel, also you could see when we were building this guy that the leg plugged into here. So now as a result, you get your leg swivel there. Double hinge on the knee. Nothing in the foot though, from the standpoint, you can't do anything down here. You get your ankle rocking foot there, and that also hinges back and forth. Can't really turn it too much because like the moss kind of butts itself in the way, but not that would be all that big of a deal. And of course, I've mentioned it, so what kind of reviewer would I be without bringing in the DC Universe Swamp Thing, which also so happened to be a SDCC Swamp Thing. And we'll just get some height differences. We've already got 8.5 inches clocked for Man-Thing. Swamp Thing stand at closer to about 10 inches. Give or take, he was about 9 3/4 of an inch tall. I think size-wise, Swamp Thing's way too tall. And of course, one of the things that is a detriment to this figure, while it is neat to feel like a rubber, like a rubber casing over top of the figure, it does kind of suck that you can't really see access to the joints. The joints are hinged in there, but you don't really get access to them. That you always do feel like the joints are going to break. If they could only take cues really from what Marvel did here with Man-Thing and kind of incorporate a similar tone to that and give us like a Swamp Thing of this sort of breakdown, I think I would be pretty happy with that. Proportionately, Man-Thing's a little bit of a broader character than Swamp Thing, but I think you can very much see kind of like early stages of what you could really do with a Swamp Thing. Even like a customizer could probably do something with Swamp Thing, taking cues here from Man-Thing's figure. Alright, so now it's time to have a look at my top 3 favorite figures from this wave, and I have to admit, this was probably one of the hardest waves to come up with a definitive top 3. There was a lot of good figures in this wave, and even like thinking of the worst figures, even the worst figures were only bad figures because of a few slight things here and there. This is probably one of the more star-studded Marvel lineup from the Marvel Legends lines. So again, very, very difficult to come up with a top 3. I probably would say, of my top 3 favorite figures, I probably would go with, I'm going to bring in Bullseye. Bullseye is my number 1. You may say, Bullseye, number 1. Bullseye, I would say, is probably my number 1 favorite figure from this line. Number 2, I would probably say, is Punisher. And number 3, this was a toss-up, and I'm still actually still somewhat deciding, but I'm going to go with Elektra. Now, keeping in mind, these are my top 3 favorite figures, but again, it was very, very close. The worst figure from this line, and it's only by a slight margin, I would say, is Jessica Jones. The face is good, but again, it seems like it's slightly too low on her face, or the face seems too low on her head, that I would say this is the worst figure from the wave. But even like this being the worst figure, this could easily have been the best figure from another wave. It just so happens that this is such a good wave, it was very hard to find the worst figure. Then after this, I would probably say maybe Daredevil is my second least favorite figure, and my fourth favorite figure I would probably say is Blade. But these are my top 3 favorites. What are your 3 favorites down below? Let me know if you have had a chance to pick up this line for yourself, or maybe even just based on these reviews. What are your top 3 favorite figures from this line? Man-Thing is one fantastic looking figure, and generally this is one instance where it doesn't happen too often. Not only did I enjoy the figures that made up the figure wave, but I also enjoyed the build of figure as a result of it. It was just as rewarding looking at the individual figures as it was rewarding building the final Man-Thing. And again, I say this, it doesn't happen very often. A lot of times I may drudge through trying to do the reviews of some Marvel Legends lines where the figures really aren't that spectacular, but the payoff at least is a really good Build-A-Figure. Or in some instances, the Build-A-Figure isn't spectacular, but at least some of the individual figures are really good. Man-Thing is a very distinct sort of wave because you're really getting good figures and you're leading up to an especially good Build-A-Figure as well. So it's a very strange wave in the fact that it does pretty much everything really well across the board. If you guys are interested in picking up this wave for yourself and building this very impressive Man-Thing, you can head over to Big Bad Toy Store right now and get this wave as it's currently available in stock. If you guys also haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, what are you waiting for? Hit that little subscribe button down below. You won't miss a beat when it comes to future videos. And as always, guys, thanks for watching as you always do. I'll see you next time.